Hello, everyone. Good morning if you're in the United States. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good evening to those watching from Asia. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Asia Society, joining you today from New York for this edition of our special programming in conjunction with the Asia Society Policy Institute on the coronavirus, the global outbreak, and all of its global implications. Today, we take a look at the staggering impact on global trade and global supply chains, something that will impact the world really in an unprecedented fashion. It already is to some extent, not just in this country, but around the world, and not just in a short-term way, but in long-term fashion as well. We'll be joined in a moment by my colleague, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Wendy Cutler, who is in Washington today, and who is, as many of you will know, one of the great experts on global trade and these issues to be found anywhere. Just before we get started, as always, a couple of updates on where things stand in terms of the coronavirus outbreak here in New York, which is emerging rapidly. I don't like the word really, but as the epicenter of the crisis, 21,000 cases at this hour, actually a little north of there, in New York State, and well more than half of those in New York City, more than 13,000 cases there, 125 deaths reported in the city, and 157 statewide. I should say confirmed cases because, of course, we don't know as the testing unfolds how many people actually are carrying the virus. Two small bits of good news to report on this Tuesday from around the world. Italy, for the second day running, has reported a drop in the death rate there. And in China, in Wuhan, the big metropolis where the outbreak began just a couple of months ago, for the first time, public transportation was up and running in that city. We've just had word, you may have heard as well, that the Olympics, Tokyo 2020, have been postponed. And in Washington, D.C., where Wendy Cutler, as I said, is joining us, the Trump administration and U.S. policymakers, lawmakers have been wrestling over the details of what would be an unprecedented relief package for those affected by the virus and its impact. A reminder as we get started, we are streaming here on Facebook Live and YouTube, and there are comment functions on both of those sites. So, and platforms, if you have a comment or a question for us this morning, send them our way. So Wendy Cutler, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I feel the need on these programs now to ask, you doing okay? You and your family, everything all right?
Well, thanks, Tom. You know, we're doing okay. Like everyone else, we're adjusting to this new world. My son is home from college, finishing his semester online. My husband and I are teleworking. And I just wanted to really welcome everyone for joining us this morning. I know everyone is adjusting, dealing with major challenges. Our heart goes out to everyone, including my colleagues now in New York, where it seems the numbers are increasing. But thanks, Tom, we're doing okay. And I would just say, with respect to the program today, we're going to be talking about trade and supply chains. And hopefully by the end of this program, you'll understand how important trade and supply chains are to an effective response to this public health emergency.
I'm glad you said that, Wendy, and glad to hear that things are good with you and your family. But when you and I first talked about this the other day, I'll be the first to admit my first reaction was, well, shouldn't we be focusing on the core human public health elements of this? But as you say, this colossal disruption, if you will, to global trade and supply chains is already, I was going to say, will impact us all. It is impacting so many people already. You have demand plunging for so many goods, supply of so many other goods down as well, because businesses aren't working and factories are shuttered. But there's something else in play, and this is where I'd love to begin. You have a lot of governments, including the United States government, saying things to the effect of, you know, we want to keep our supplies within our borders. We want to keep the means of production within our borders. We want to control these things and put our own people back to work. So that sounds like a big macro issue, really. But as you say, it has a lot of implications. So first of all, what's going on with that and why is it happening?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And look, it's understandable that governments want to do as much as they can do to help their own citizens, particularly in a global health crisis. At the same time, I will argue that we need to work with other countries. We're all in this together. The United States can't solve this issue alone. And particularly when it comes to trade, what we're seeing is more and more countries now are imposing export restrictions on the export of medical supplies and equipment. And over 50 countries have export restrictions in place. They're all a little different, but these export restrictions really can spread around the world and, in my view, really damage our ability, including in the US, to address the challenges that we're facing in our hospitals and across our country and the world.
So just a quick follow-up, which you might put in the category of, I'm not an economist question. What's wrong with that? If I'm the leader of a country that is grappling, or for that matter, the leader of a state like mine, New York, with all these issues, I don't want a lot of, or I don't want any goods and supplies that might help my own constituents and my citizens. I'm not saying this is my approach, but I mean, I can understand the impulse, keep it all here. What's wrong with it?
Right. So what's wrong with it is no one country makes all of this stuff. So even if you make masks, a lot of countries may make masks, but they don't make the high-end ventilators, or they don't make the CT scans, or they don't make the gowns. And so if you're going to put export restrictions, you can imagine other countries are going to follow. And what we'll end up in is a world with a lot of shortages, no one really benefiting from what others are producing, and frankly, higher prices. And again, a world that is fragmented now when it really should be coming together to try and coordinate more and figure out who has supplies. Maybe some are needed domestically, that's fine, but do they have some that they can ship to others? And that kind of discussion and conversation needs to be going on.
Okay, now I want to get in a moment to, of course, the country that has a lot of those supplies, and that makes a very large proportion of a lot of the medical supplies you just mentioned, and that's China. But before we do, your comments put in mind some of the different approaches of some of our officials in this country. And I'll single out, again, partly because it's where I'm sitting, but also because it's where the case loads are soaring. So Governor Cuomo has made pretty clear here, almost in a way to be almost pleading with the global community and officials to say, I'll take face masks, gowns, ventilators from whoever has them, wherever they are, whatever I need to do to get them here. The approach, and you don't hear this publicly, but one reads about it from the federal government, from the Trump administration, seems much more, the president has said, okay, Elon Musk, car makers, whomever, go, you guys start producing these things. We want it done here. Is there real daylight between the Cuomo approach and the Trump approach here, would you say?
There is, but let's just take a step back. There's no doubt that there is an acute shortage of medical supplies and equipment now here in the United States and other countries around the world. But let's just take the US for a moment. There are with an acute shortage, you have two options, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first is to increase production at home and incentivize companies here to start producing in mass quantities the types of mass equipment supplies we need. And we see that happening already. But in addition to ramping up production at home, which is okay and needed, we should also be working with our trading partners to import as much as we can now. And we're seeing that. And particularly, I noticed that Taiwan a couple of days ago announced that they're sending us a lot of masks. Korea has announced they're sending a lot of these test kits all around the world. So we're beginning to see, as the level of the effect of the virus is subsiding in Asia, that these countries, including China now, are beginning to export more. And in my view, we should be welcoming those exports. But at the same time as we're ramping up domestic production, we're going to need both sources.
Right. So let's pivot to China now for a moment. I was struck, there's a piece in the New York Times about some of the issues we're talking about today, and in particular, the ramping up of production in China, which began, of course, because they had such an acute crisis. I mean, they still do, but they have, as I said a moment ago, it appears they're coming through the other side now. I think the figure was 100 million mask production. I don't remember in the time frame, but I mean, they really are, they can churn these out, and they do. But the vitriol, which of course is a part of the larger state of the U.S.-China relationship right now, has, American officials saying things like, well, we don't want face mask diplomacy, right? Meaning propaganda gains for the Chinese as they send, and in some cases, don't just sell, but they are offering to deliver these goods pro bono, I suppose, or at a cut rate to other countries. And then in China, there were some very, very strong comments from, I believe it was the foreign ministry spokesperson, who said, fine, if you don't want our stuff, if you think it's subpar or you think there's something wrong with Chinese goods, go get infected or something to that effect. How is that playing out? And are the Chinese trying to, use this as a tool of soft power, I guess, to help other countries?
Yeah, and that's a great question, but let me just underscore that there are other countries and economies in Asia, once again, that they ramped up their domestic production, and now that the virus has showing signs of subsiding in their countries, they have this excess supply, and they are offering it and selling it to the rest of the world, and that should be welcome. And in my view, that should be welcome from China as well. Reading the back and forth between the US and China is quite unfortunate at this time, because right now we should be working together. We don't need to be best friends, but this type of issue really kind of cries out for a multilateral response, and one where the two largest economies in the world have shared interest here. And again, we should be working together. And in my view, we should be welcoming their offers of providing equipment and needed supplies to us as well.
It's interesting you say that. It puts in mind, not long ago, Orville Schell, our colleague at the Asia Society, in another conversation about another, dip or valley in the U.S.-China relationship, said, some people are saying, this is months or a year ago, I don't remember, said what really might be the one thing that would help is if there were some global calamity or crisis that the two countries could collaborate on. And here we are, and it doesn't seem to be happening. But just to be clear, Wendy, on one point, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question, is it your understanding that the enmity between the two countries is actually at the point now where we could be importing a much larger degree or amount of some of these goods, and it's not happening for that reason?
Well, I don't know the technical details of what, what the trade flows or the trade offerings are, but I mean, it's clear that China is providing a lot of masks now to Europe. They started with Italy, but now they're supplying all around Europe. And when you talk about diplomacy here, China has something to offer. They have masks again. They ramped up production, but again, for the US, there's a lot we could be doing on the diplomatic front as well. The United States is the chair and the host of the G7 this year, which is an organization of 7 leading industrialized economies. The actual meeting, the summit meeting scheduled for June, will not take place, but there are monthly calls now between the leaders. Different ministers now are having weekly or periodic calls. And as leader of the G7 and a real integral member of the G20, which is having a call among leaders today, I think, there's a lot we could be doing on the diplomatic front that would show that we are, part of the global solution here and not just turning inward and, trying to shun interaction with our friends and allies in other countries right now.
Right. It's a heck of a time to be scoring points, right? I want to divert for a moment to a question that we have coming in from a viewer on YouTube. Amelia Schister asks, do we still have tariffs on goods, including medical supplies from China? So are there American tariffs on those goods? And if so, why don't we waive them?
Yeah, well, you're singing to the choir here. As a result of the US-China trade war, the United States did put tariffs in against Chinese imports. Some of those tariffs have been lifted through the exclusion process, including a few weeks ago, we did lift even more tariffs that in the medical supply arena. But some tariffs still remain. And let's also remember, these exclusions that are given are temporary. They're not permanent. And so in my view, this is the perfect time for the United States to look through all of those tariffs on the $360 billion worth of Chinese imports and maybe err on the side of rolling back too many tariffs. But this is a time when we should not have any import barriers or tariffs on, potential equipment that we need. And we should be calling on other countries to do the same. In general, our tariffs in the medical and pharmaceutical area are low. Other countries have higher tariffs. And this is the time where, again, like the G20 or the WTO should come together. The members should say, at least for now, even if it's on a temporary basis, let's all agree to roll back these tariffs for as long as this crisis goes on. Why would you want to be making your imports more expensive now? You want to be facilitating trade. You want to get rid of the import restrictions, but also the export restrictions.
Right.
You want these materials and supplies to get as quickly as possible to those in need.
Now, I guess in a way this will be in the category of belaboring the point, but you reminded me, Wendy, yesterday when we were talking about this, that Peter Navarro, who long before this crisis erupted, he's a top advisor to the president and I guess you'd say a hawk on the China relationship generally, but asked about this question or a variant of it the other day. He said, in a crisis, we have no allies. Now, I don't know that that's the argument winning the day at the moment in the White House, but tough to get to where you just suggested the United States needs to go if that point is part of the discussion in the room, I would think.
Yeah, and there are definitely hardliners in the administration who have been advocating long before the coronavirus that we need to bring our supply chains home to the United States. And now Navarro and perhaps others are advocating that this pandemic just shows the necessity to do this and do this quickly. And apparently in a draft executive order on these types of restrictions in the United States called like a Buy America executive order on pharmaceutical and medical devices is kicking around in the White House under discussion. In my view, there may be some legitimate products in the supply chain that over time we do need to look at. We need to assess our vulnerabilities in our supply chains. I assume once this crisis is over, companies will be doing a thorough review of their supply chains to reduce their vulnerabilities and promote diversification and multiple sources of supply. And the government should do the same. And in areas, if there are legitimate areas where we feel we're just overly dependent on China, for example, in the pharmaceutical ingredient area, then let's come up with some thoughtful policies to incentivize production here and deal with this issue in a way that's not going to increase prices for our consumers. But again, do it in a thoughtful way that brings in our stakeholders and our consumers so we come up with a well thought through policy that doesn't end up hurting us. And, again, my view on all of this, There are kind of short-term responses we should take to get through the crisis, and then we'll have time and the lessons learned and longer-term policy changes that we should be making based on what we learned through the crisis.
So let's get to the longer-term issues in a moment, Wendy. I do want to, just so our viewers and our audience understand, back to the point we're discussing about, a governor's approach, whether it's Governor Cuomo or someone else, and the federal government's. The president, I believe, has been pretty consistent in saying, not everyone for themselves, but encouraging states to do everything they can, and then going to the private sector and say, companies, build what you can. But if, back to Governor Cuomo, he tomorrow wants to cut a deal or get somehow arranges a big shipment from a Chinese supplier of medical goods in the current atmosphere or any atmosphere, to what extent is that going to be hampered by the approach of the federal government and people like Peter Navarro, or is he free to do that in this, okay, go knock yourself out, do what you can do, governor, approach to get himself? I mean, it doesn't sound like a great way to do business anyway, but do the strictures and the tariffs and everything else, are they going to be an impediment to Andrew Cuomo getting a whole bunch of masks, gowns, ventilators to his state?
I don't think so at this point. Remember, just last week, Jack Ma from Alibaba shipped a whole lot of medical supplies here, and other Chinese suppliers are apparently doing the same.
But that was a gift, right? Or was it? Or did he ask for money for it? Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, the trade channels are open here. I mean, if there are tariffs that still apply, then the importer will have to pay them. But as far as I know, we're free to import these goods from China.
Right. So we have a question from another viewer, which gets to your long-term point. Isn't this basically an example of America first, something that the Trump administration has been interested in and wanted to do from the beginning?
Well, again, I think that there are people in the administration that since day one have been arguing we need to bring all of this production back to the United States. And so in this crisis, I think they're trying to capitalize off this by showing how vulnerable we are to being overly dependent on other countries for our goods and services. But again, I don't think that's the right policy. And frankly, in a global pandemic, this is precisely the type of global occurrence where you need multilateral cooperation. You need to be getting the needed supplies and equipment to those who need it quickly and need it the most. You need to coordinate with other countries. You need to, at senior levels, kind of disavow protectionist policies. But these are things, again, as the viewer just said, these are things that go against a lot of this Buy America. So I think coming out of this, the United States, again, we're going to have to look through, really think through what went on here, how did this end up, and, were we better served, or would we have been better served if we worked closely with other countries to share information, coordinate, work on vaccine development, keep our trade channels open, and frankly, help the neediest countries around the world. We have not seen this virus yet spread to Latin America and Africa. They're beginning, I know, in Africa to report some cases, but once that starts happening, a lot of those infrastructures, they are not ready for this. So again, this isn't something you can just cabin off our country. We're part of the global community, and it's in our interest that we work together with others and we solve this issue so we can all get back to a safe and healthy world.
So you've half answered my next question, Wendy, which is, I mean, you spent a long and distinguished career as a trade negotiator, finishing at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. You've negotiated these kinds of trade arrangements around the world and advocated for free trade in different parts of the world and in the U.S. government as well. What would you put yourself, if you don't mind, in the Oval Office right now, and you're in a discussion of the sort we're having, And let's do this in a short-term policy way and a long-term policy way. Short-term, maybe finish this sentence. Mr. President, here's what we have to do right now, or what we ought to do to help with this supply chain problem and general supply problem we're having. What should be done in the next days and weeks?
We need to lift all import restrictions on needed medical supplies and equipment, and we need to work with others to lift their export restrictions so we can receive their shipments. That's number two. And number three, we need to make sure that our shipping and air freight lines and our ability to trade remains open. And four, we need to work with our private sector and our companies very closely to ramp up production here. But again, that's not the only solution. As they ramp up production, we should be inviting imports into the United States.
Got it. So longer term, when things have ebbed, or I suppose longer term, you can still start now. The question I have, or a lot of people will have, is preparedness. There's so much talk now about preparedness on the public health side for when the next public health crisis comes. What, from your vantage point and your area of expertise, what we've been talking about, what can be done to mitigate, for a year from now, 5 years from now, so we are not in the position we are? I guess you've mentioned G7, G20, but you've also mentioned ramping up production here. What would be in kind of a Marshall Plan, if you will, for where we need to go so that we don't have this issues in the next go round?
Well, number one, we need to do a deep dive into our supply chain vulnerabilities and which medical products and supplies and pharmaceuticals, we need to come up with a strategy to ensure that we have adequate supplies and we're not overly dependent on one source. This could mean ramping up domestic production, but it could also mean diversifying our sources among countries. So that would be one long-term response. I also think just as companies are going to be reviewing their supply chains, and probably they will find the need to build up their inventories. I think the US is going to have to look at their domestic stockpile of a lot of these products and supplies as well, because it seems we were left pretty flat-footed with an inadequate national stockpile. And third, what I would advocate is we should work with other countries in the WTO to promote an initiative of really free trade among these products. Everything from what first responders need, masks, goggles, gowns, to what patients need. And not only get rid of restrictions on the import side, but again, get rid of restrictions on the export side. Just one other point on the export side. Ideally, countries would just announce, we're getting rid of all of our bans. We are now going to allow the free flow of our supplies and equipment. And that would be welcome. But if that's a bridge too far, countries can work together short of that to at least get on, to make some meaningful changes, to make countries think twice about their export restrictions. For example, they could agree that if there are export restrictions, they will be transparent about which products they cover. They will make these restrictions as temporary as possible. They will entertain requests from other countries to lift the ban with respect to urgently needed supplies and equipment. So I just want to put that on the table, because there's so much that can be done by working with other countries now. Ideally, you would lift all restrictions, but if that's not possible, there are things that can be done short of that. And those are the conversations we should be having with other countries now.
So Patricia Nelson on YouTube has what amounts to, I don't think she could possibly have written this quickly, but it's almost like a follow-up to what you just said. Do you think the U.S. will develop an industrial policy in response to these? So do you think the United States will respond and do some of the things you've just been suggested when it comes to industrial policy.
Well, yeah, I mean, what is industrial policy? Are we going to like take over all of this production? I don't think so. But again, I think that over time, we will need to identify our acute vulnerabilities and come up with responses, because no one wants to be vulnerable in a crisis, in an emergency. And we will need to diversify our sources of this equipment and supplies while ramping up our domestic production as well.
And then we have, I think this is more of a comment than a question, Zenoidable, if I pronounce that correctly, also from watching on YouTube, asks, Navarro's Buy American executive order would mainly affect purchases by DoD and VA hospitals. So he wants veterans hospitals to pay more and have worse access to the medical tech they need. I don't know if you want to let that go with comment or without comment.
Well, just number one, my understanding, that's only part of the executive order. That initially, when this Buy America order was drafted a year or so ago, before the pandemic, it was all about imposing Buy America restrictions for the VA and other government entities, U.S. government entities that buy this stuff. I think it has been significantly expanded now to cover pharmaceuticals and go beyond government procurement. But I think the viewer makes an excellent point. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted more open markets in the government procurement area was to really allow for the United States to have the option to buy high quality equipment and supplies, but at lower prices by being able to entertain bids from other countries. Of course, if bids from other countries include products that are not high quality or don't fit the needs, we're not forced to buy them.
Right.
But again, I think it's important to have that competition, which leads to lower prices. And frankly, that's, in a time when a lot of people are complaining about how expensive drugs are, we need to think very carefully before we do things to raise prices more.
Thanks for that. Now, Doug Palmer, a journalist, also watching on YouTube. Interesting question here. Following up on your call for coordinated G20 action, he wants to know, what have you heard from your former colleagues at the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR office? Is there any indication that Ambassador Lighthizer, that's the current head of USTR, is contemplating any action on that front? You got a scoop for us?
I love Doug Palmer, and I know him well. But I'm not aware of any of those efforts. And anything in reading Ambassador Lighthizer's op-ed yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, to be kind of taking on the need to work globally to address concerns and seem to down the role of trade restrictions in limiting supplies and purchases in this sector.
Right. We take one more question, and it comes from Facebook. And this one, it's interesting. Not long ago, you spent most of your time, and whenever you and I were talking, it was about something called Phase 1, the big U.S.-China trade deal, which seems like it almost feels like ancient history now. It's not that long ago. So we have a viewer on Facebook who says, or asks, how does the current crisis impact the U.S.-China trade deal signed in January? Does that deal still stand, and do you think we're going to see a resumption of the trade war?
Well, first of all, I think you make a great point, because this agreement the Phase 1 China trade deal came into effect about 5 weeks ago. It seems so much longer.
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, though, we are seeing China adherence according to the timeframes provided in the agreement so far. Now, particularly when they were suffering from the worst part of the virus, many of us, including me, were surprised that they went ahead and issued the rules and regulations that they agreed to implement the agriculture and intellectual property provisions of the agreement. There's important work on intellectual property and action plan that China owes the United States. Hopefully we'll see that soon. So incredibly enough, it seems that things are operating as smoothly as they can with respect to implementation of phase one. The one area where I think everyone thinks that China will not be able to fully implement its obligations, and that is to reach the enormous purchasing targets that were included for this year and next year in the agreement, at a time when not only is China not at full production capacity, its demand is down, and now the United States production capacity will be down, and it's hard to see how those numbers, which were always a stretch, are ever going to be met. But my hope is that China will continue to purchase in the coming months. Just yesterday, according to the newspapers, China did announce a major purchase of US wheat. So hopefully this will continue. I think it's still in both sides' interest not to allow these trade issues to kind of further lead to a deterioration in the relationship. But I do think the notion of launching a phase two negotiation, particularly in this environment, is pretty far off. And I don't see that happening in any real-time scenario.
Yeah, we have a little crisis to get through first. Thank you, Wendy. Just a couple of reminders from us at the Asia Society. The programming continues on this platform. In the next few days, well, on Thursday, another giant China story that we haven't heard much about lately. What will the coronavirus do to that incredibly, I guess, unprecedented infrastructure plan called the Belt and Road Initiative in China? That's Thursday. On Friday, we'll look at Korea, South Korea, how they flattened the curve there, to use the phrase everyone is using, and also a look at what we can glean of what's going on in North Korea. That's Friday morning Eastern time. And on Monday, a look at one of the really beyond the public health and commercial issues we've discussed, the terrible scourge of racism and xenophobia that have surfaced in many quarters around the world in the wake of the outbreak. Thank you, Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, for joining us, for all your great insight and observations. We appreciate those. Thanks to all of you watching, wherever you may be this morning, afternoon, or evening. And we invite you to stay tuned and stay with us at the Asia Society and stay safe and healthy. As we say, we are in this together. I'm Tom Nagorski. Thank you.